Light within my heart, light within my thoughts, light within my words. May one and all and everything, blessed and loved, ever be. Welcome. I am Sister Who. Within this ongoing television show, we talk about a lot of very complex subjects, and I think it's important to remember that every discussion is an ongoing discussion. There should never be a final word on the subject because there's always more to learn and more to say and a different perspective to integrate. And pretty much every perspective needs to have its turn of adding to the conversation, because the topic is so multifaceted and complex that unless we hear from all the different perspectives, we can't accomplish a holistic, integrated understanding. The subject I wanted to discuss today is the injustice that is inadvertently created by various criminal categorization. An example comes to mind of someone who was labeled a sex offender because of poor judgment. The person is not a predatory person. It is basically a situation, and obviously there are thousands of such situations, if not millions, across this country, in which the law has decided an age of accountability, an age of adulthood, and someone who is a year or two younger and someone who is a year or two older decide that they want to be intimate together, and then maybe the younger one later changes their mind. The older one proceeded in good faith and didn't violate any personal boundaries at the time, but the younger one decided that they wish they hadn't have done that later because the relationship didn't work out or whatever. And it becomes a rather frightening imbalance of power in terms of the older one, which is why in most circles they'll simply say, don't ever cross the line between, don't ever be intimate with somebody who is not a legal adult. Poor judgment, definitely. It's a reflection of our current system, though. There are countries around the world that have much lower ages of legal adulthood, where the same issue, if the interaction had occurred in that country, wouldn't be an issue, wouldn't be a legal issue. It would be that each person entered into it in a mutually respectful fashion, made the choices they made, and maybe they wish they hadn't later. I mean, I'm sure there are many people who, after being divorced, wish they had never married a particular person in the first place. There are mistakes that can't be unwritten, though. Where my heart goes out to a particular person, though, was when he was actually, I suppose you could say, seduced or baited by someone looking for an initial sexual experience before they were legal adult, and the answer should have been no. And yet it was so, when the story was related to me, it was so outrageous that once the action was completed, the teenager immediately turned to the adult and said, "And now I've got you." And it turned into several years of blackmail. And in the end, when the teenager decided that they no longer needed the adult person, tossed them to the legal system for whatever, and just say, "Oh, I never meant to do that in the first place, and besides I was underage and didn't have good judgment." And the person who was labeled or categorized as the perpetrator, one of the most gentle and loving persons I know, but also a little bit too trusting at times. And I'm sure, where I'm thinking of a specific person, I'm sure this is not an isolated case, that this has been repeated hundreds of times all across the country. Humanity in general, I suppose, really hasn't learned how to manage its sexuality all that intelligently. We're still trying to figure out what is right and what is wrong. and it varies so much from one place to another, and it varies with self-knowledge. There are countless teenagers across the country who may engage in sexual expressions trying to prove to themselves who and what they are. Gay and lesbian teenagers who, because of repressive environments, don't want to be gay or lesbian, and trying to find out, am I really, am I not? I can be straight if I want to be. Well, they may believe it at the time, or they may not know it. Discerning an orientation, perhaps even more so for a teen that begins to discover a feeling of being transgender. That's a radical shift to make, and it's not the sort of decision that should be made quickly or easily or without lots and lots of thought and contemplation. Unfortunately, in many, many cases, there aren't supportive adults around who are sufficiently mature and calm about discussing such subjects that the teen would have someone to talk to, even if that adult were available. But then it also raises the question of whether sufficient trust has been built with that person that the teen could be open about such a very deep and sensitive personal area. On a lighter note, but a similar sort of subject, I was watching a video on talking to your kids about sex many, many years ago, and there was a woman who was a staff person of a counseling agency who was there, and she described how she was attempting to describe inappropriate situations to a 5-year-old girl, and trying to educate her that if anyone ever touches you inappropriately, you need to tell someone, you need to report it, you need to say, no, this is not okay, no, don't do this. In trying to talk with this 5-year-old girl about this sensitive subject, it was quite amusing that the little girl is sitting there listening very attentively and very innocently and openly to whatever this respected adult is telling her. And finally the little girl reached over and put her tiny little hand on top of the woman's hand and said, if it makes you this upset, we don't have to talk about it. And the woman just really took that as a wake-up call, that if she was that uncomfortable discussing sex, that she was communicating her discomfort more than the basic information of how to say no, how to recognize inappropriate situations and inappropriate advances, and how to respond to any occurrence of that should ever happen. If we don't have the maturity to address these issues and to wrestle with the difficult questions without condemning whoever is involved, to use an extreme example, in a rape situation, there may be one perpetrator, but there is never less than 2 victims. Somehow, to have the psyche, the psychology and the emotions able to commit a rape, my understanding is that we are talking about a very, very broken person. They have been victimized so many times, and in most cases, if not all cases, they have tried to get help and no one has responded. Or maybe they didn't know they need help. Maybe they grew up in an environment where things were so skewed and the education they received about sexual intimacy was so bizarre that they were never able to establish a clear understanding of what really is okay and what is not, and how do you approach certain situations. At one time, there was a time before, let's say, a better way to phrase it perhaps, is that there was a time before the term date rape was understood. That it was simply a situation that no one had really discussed, and no one had a term for it. Nobody had established any moral standard around it. That when someone is drunk or incapacitated or under the influence of exhaustion, alcohol, drugs, whatever, that during those times getting them to pronounce the words "I consent" does not mean that they're really consenting, because they're not in the right mind. They're not thinking clearly. And so the law came to a point where we could recognize that when people are not thinking clearly, their responses cannot be considered legitimate responses. Date rape essentially grew out of an understanding that if someone is had too much alcohol and they're not thinking clearly, and you ask them, "Do you want to have sex?" there is no answer except no that can be accepted, because they're not thinking clearly, because they're not able to take responsibility for themselves in those sorts of situations. You have to wait until the effects of whatever substance have worn off and ask them when they are thinking clearly, and when you know that it's really their answer and not the substance that's doing the talking for them. The injustice that is the point, that was the inspiration for this discussion on the show here, however, is recognizing when, in order to legislate for a group, laws set up certain categories. If it's this, it goes in this category. If it's this, then it goes in that category. In dealing with the actual living of life, no individual or individual situation readily falls into our established categories. Categories are created as intellectual constructs, as schemes or systems that we create with our minds. The actual living of life deals with people and individuals and situations, and if this and what about that, and well, if someone came from an abusive environment, or if someone came from a perfect environment, or if someone had this conversation, or if nothing was ever said. All these variables. The basic premise behind the law, behind having any laws, is that people are responsible for their choices. To what degree and in what way is where things get very, very vague and very confused. At no point in time, I suggest, is it wise to withdraw that responsibility and to withdraw accountability and to allow negative behavior to persist simply because someone supposedly can't be held responsible. If they cannot be held responsible for the behavior, then somehow their behavior still needs to be curtailed, because the actions we're talking about are not tolerable actions. Doing violence to another person is never a tolerable action. If someone feels so broken or distraught by their past experiences, by what they were taught or by what they failed to learn, that they cannot conduct themselves appropriately within that situation, then they need to be kept out of that situation. This is jumping to a very different sort of situation, I suppose, but it seems to a similar dynamic, I guess. An argument I was having with, a discussion, because we never really raised our voices or got into an argument about it, but it was a discussion of the responsibility of people with autism. That, can you be responsible for behaving appropriately in a certain situation, especially for those on the autistic spectrum who are lower functioning. And by lower functioning, I don't mean that they're less or that they're inferior. I simply mean that it's a different degree of skills for social interaction. It doesn't mean they're less important as a person, or that they should be respected any less, or that they should have any less freedom, really. But my perspective as an autistic man is that I do not wish to be placed in a situation that I'm not ready to handle. In a similar sort of way, jumping back to our earlier subject, if someone is seeking connection with another person, they're seeking love, they want to experience themselves physically, They want to engage in sexuality, but hopefully in a constructive way. But they may not have all the information they need to know what is constructive and what is damaging, and what is the sort of thing that you won't regret later. A lot of this discussion, like that illustration of the woman in the sex education video, of the little girl saying, if it makes you this upset, we don't have to talk about it. It's because we haven't talked about it, and because we haven't developed maturity and a breadth of understanding, that there are all sorts of things that need to be discussed that we don't have the vocabulary or the maturity to discuss in an effective, intelligent way. When we say a sex offender, we want to deal with someone who is so psychologically broken that they are predatory and that they are trying to heal themselves psychologically in totally wrong ways by regarding others, children or adults, as objects rather than persons, and attempting to work out their internal imbalance by inappropriate interaction with that person. Yes, they need help. No, that does not excuse anything they did. They're human beings, but they're very broken human beings, and we need to try to help them as much as we can. We need to be honest, though, when we have allowed people to become so broken that we can no longer heal them. One of the curiosities of this show, I suppose, is the where, because of the nature of a single episode, we want to keep things focused on a particular subject and deal just with this subject. But of course, everything is all interwoven. The thought that just crossed my mind, so I guess I'm supposed to throw it into this discussion, is the relationship between governments and personnel in the military. War is a psychologically and emotionally damaging situation. It's like asking someone to go into a toxic environment, and because there's something in that environment that needs to be done or secured or managed or taken care of, whatever metaphor you want to use. The example comes to mind of a particular episode, a Star Trek movie, in which the character of Spock has to go into an area that is filled with toxic radiation in order to do something. It has to be done there in order to save the ship and keep it from blowing up and crashing and so forth. Somebody has to make that sacrifice and throw themselves into harm's way in order to save everyone else's life. In a similar sort of way, there are objectives in war situations that are considered so important that someone has to be willing to make the ultimate sacrifice, or we have to accept that a greater loss will be incurred. And so people go into those situations and do what needs to be done, and if they survive, they then come out of that situation to hopefully return home. The challenge becomes whether that experience has so damaged them that they are able to return home, that they are able to go from being a civilian to being a soldier to being a civilian again. And there have been cases where they come back and they're so psychologically damaged that they don't know how to become a civilian again. And my heart goes out to them, but I would also say we need to hold our government responsible, that if you're going to send them into this situation, you need to provide support when they come out of it. There needs to be some sort of healing situation, some sort of hospital of some sort available to them to help them return to being a healthy, grounded, solid citizen. In the same way that if a building were on fire, firemen go into the building, they save people's lives, they put out the fire, they do what needs to be done. When they come out, they may have to be treated for smoke inhalation. It is a specific process that we have worked out of how you respond to this sort of threat, this sort of internal injury, in order to restore the body to a fully healthy, balanced, functioning sort of condition. Whether it's with people in the military, whether it's with people going into prison, whether it's with people who have been through psychological and emotional abuse, there are stresses and challenges and aspects of those situations that no one should be expected to face alone. That just as it takes a village to raise a child, as the old saying says, it takes a village to do a lot of other things too. It takes a village to help somebody deal with really tragic things that happen. It helps a village. It takes a village to help a mother deal with the loss of a child. I mean, that's a heart-wrenching, horrible, horrible, severe thing to go through for a mother or a father. That you have this child, and the expectation society gives us is always that parents outlive their children. But occasionally, whether due to auto accidents or all sorts of other things, maybe fell off of something, got into a cupboard they weren't supposed to be in, and got their hands on some chemicals, a house fire, any number of things, the parent survives and the child is gone. I recall reading of an airline crash in which a mother had her infant, and the stewardess, according to the established protocol, following, the stewardess didn't know anything different than what she had been told to tell the passengers. And she said, according to our manual of dealing with plane crashes, you need to place your child at your feet, right in front of you, and cross your arms across your lap and put your head down on your knees. Well, the plane crashed, and call it a freak accident or whatever, the woman was still sitting in her seat, but all the rest of the plane in front of her had been ripped off. And all she could say is, "Where's my baby? Where's my baby?" I hope that the village, the community around that woman, did not expect her to deal with that loss without help. That would be such a tragic thing to go through. When we do our categorizations for the sake of having laws, some basis of law, we need to remember that all these things need interpretation, both by the judges, by the juries, by everybody in the neighborhood around them, by around the incident, by around the people who are involved. That the perpetrators are also victims, and their violent behavior needs to be curtailed, but it can't stop there, or we become less human ourselves by denying their humanity. At the same time as recognizing all that, though, we also have this frustrating, ongoing challenge of wrestling with our own powerlessness, that there are some things we can't heal, and there are some mistakes that can't be unwritten, and there are some choices that can't be undone. And the question we are then left with is either how to invent a device or a method or something that will prevent this from ever happening again, or how to, it sounds so pathetic, how to compensate, how to put as positive closure as we can on something that historically will always be tragic. There is nothing not tragic about people being lost in house fires, about people being lost in war, about people coming back psychologically damaged from all sorts of various situations, people feeling devalued by decisions that their politicians and legislators have made, people who are fleeing one oppressive situation to another, and the choice is either to live in oppression or become an illegal immigrant, and they choose to be an illegal immigrant in the interest of having a life worth living at all. I don't know that I can condemn them for that, but the consequences are very complicated. It is important that these sorts of discussions go on, that we remember there is no final word on this or any other discussion. And that as we do this discussion, there needs to be a whole lot of listening and a whole lot of caring while insisting upon an end to violent actions between each other. Curtail the violence, remember the love, remember the humanity. This is not an object in front of you. This is a person with history, with personality, with experiences that they can't forget, with things that they need to learn, with faith that they need to recover. I hope that in all my rambling thoughts of the last half hour, I have offered some things that are helpful to you. I encourage you to continue doing your own thinking on this and other subjects as we, time and time again, wrestle with the question of, considering all of that, how then shall we live? And what sort of person should we show ourselves to be? Thank you very much for watching.